When using a pivot table, you may realize that you need to add data to it. In this lecture, I'm going to show you a couple of approaches to adding data to a pivot table source in Excel. Remember, a pivot table source is the data that the pivot table is pivoting off of. Every pivot table needs a source of data, and for this pivot table, my source is this table here. Okay, right now in this pivot table, we just have the country field in our rows, which makes it so each country is listed just once here. There are three major approaches to adding data to a pivot table. The first is changing the source range. The second is inserting inside of your data source. And the third is formatting your source data as an Excel table. Let's do the first, changing the source range. Let's first add some data to the bottom of our dataset. Let's go to the bottom of our data and then let's type a fictional country called Sparta. Let's just copy and paste the coffee production numbers from the above row. Now, if we go back to our pivot table, we don't see Sparta populated here yet. This is because the pivot table is referencing a predefined range of data, and that row that we just added is not automatically added to the range. How can we tell that? Well, we can tell that by clicking on our pivot table, going to Pivot Table Analyze, and going to Change Source Data. Here, Excel tells us the source of our data, B4 to D104, so it goes all the way down to row 104. However, our new data is in row 105. So in order to incorporate it, all we have to do is change this reference to 105, or we can make an entirely new reference altogether. However, this works, so I'm just going to click OK. And now when we scroll back up to our pivot table, we see that Sparta is now included in our pivot table. Okay, let's move on to the second approach to changing your source data, which is inserting inside of your data source. Sometimes changing your entire data source as we did before could be too much work if you're just inserting a line or two of data. The workaround for this is to insert your new data inside of your existing data source. To do this, let's highlight a row in our source data, and then let's add a new row by using the shortcut Ctrl+Shift+, or you can right-click and choose Insert. Then I'm going to choose Shift Cells Down, click OK, now we have a new row. Here, I'm going to type in another fictional country called Athens. Here, I'm also going to copy and paste the numbers from the row above. However, when we look at our pivot table, we're not yet seeing Athens. Well, this is because we need to refresh our data. To refresh our data, we go to Data, and then click Refresh All, or use the shortcut Ctrl-Alt-F5. When we do this, we see that Athens has now been properly inserted in the bottom. Okay, let's go on to our third method of adding data to our source data, which is converting your data source to an Excel table. Personally, I'm actually not a huge fan of Excel tables, but I figured that I would at least include this because they're particularly useful for pivot tables. When you use an Excel table, you can add data anywhere in your source, and Excel will automatically update to include the new data in your pivot table. Before we do this, let's go ahead and delete our existing pivot table. Next, let's go over to our table, and now we have to convert it to a table. To insert an Excel table, let's first highlight the range that we want to insert a table on. Then let's choose Table, or use the shortcut Alt+N+T. This looks good to me, so I click OK, and now we can tell that Excel has formatted my data as a table because it's changed the layout of it. Now every other row has a different color. Instead of just using a range now, we can now just name our table and use the name to reference it in our workbook. With a cell of the table selected, in order to name a table, go to the Table Design tab, and then here you can specify the name. I'm going to call it Coffee. Next, we can just insert a pivot table here. With a cell of our table selected, let's go to Insert, Pivot Table, and we can see that instead of having a range, it just names the table Coffee. I'm once again going to insert on an existing worksheet and choose here. Okay, let's once again drag our country into our rows. Now we're able to add data anywhere in the table, and Excel will automatically include it as a part of the pivot table. Let's go to the bottom of our data and once again enter in another fictional country called Allentown. Now, when I hit Tab, we can see that Excel has automatically expanded the table down to include this row of data. This is one of the advantages of using an Excel table. It will automatically include any adjacent data. Let's once again copy these coffee production numbers and paste. And now when we go up to our pivot table data, all we have to do is refresh our data using data refresh all, and we can see that Allentown now pops up in our pivot table. The same also goes for columns. I'm actually going to add a space between our table and our pivot table for this example, but now if I type a new column in called exports, we see that Excel automatically includes it as a part of the Excel table. If we go back to our pivot table and then use the shortcut Control Alt F5 to refresh our data, we see that exports is automatically included as a field in our fields list. This is one of the many advantages of using tables in Excel. And like I said, it's not my favorite method, but it tends to be pretty effective if you're going to be constantly changing your source data.